Welcome to the digital seminar series organized by the Statistics Assessment and Data Management Corps, a part of the HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Studies at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and Columbia University.
Hello, everybody. My name is Karolynn Siegel. I'm a medical sociologist and a professor of Sociomedical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Today, I'd like to talk with you about what characterizes a qualitative approach to research and when is it the right choice. There are three topics I want to cover with you. One is, how do the paradigms that guide the work of qualitative and quantitative research differ with respect to ontology and epistemology and methodology? Next, what are the commitments of a qualitative researcher? And third, when is a qualitative study the right choice? Quantitative and qualitative research subscribe to different paradigms. What is a paradigm? A paradigm's a system of inquiry characterized by a set of beliefs about the nature of social reality, that's the ontology, what counts as legitimate and valid knowledge, that's the epistemology, and about how we can obtain it, and that is the methodology. The methodology of each paradigm essentially translates the ontological and epistemological assumptions of a paradigm into guidelines for conducting research. In other words, the principles and procedures people should adhere to in that paradigm. Quantitative researchers adopt a positivist paradigm, while qualitative researchers usually adopt what's called an interpretivist or a constructionist paradigm. Because the ontology and epistemology are essentially philosophical issues, the qualitative-quantitative debate, which we hear so much about and read so much about, is essentially a philosophical one, not a methodological one. Qualitative research, as I said, subscribes to an interpretivist or a constructionist paradigm. That paradigm assumes that there are multiple social realities that are constructed through the meanings and understandings that individuals develop through their social interactions. And there are local social realities. Communities, social groups may have different social realities than others. The interpretive paradigm also assumes that the aim of inquiry is understanding of the social world from the perspective of the actor. And third, it assumes that knowledge consists of those social constructions of reality about which there is a general consensus. However, these constructions are subject to continuous revisions. In contrast, quantitative researchers subscribe to a positivist paradigm, and they believe that there is one single social and knowable reality that is out there waiting to be discovered. They assume also that the aim of inquiry is explanation, which ultimately is in the service of enabling prediction and control. And third, that knowledge consists of verifiable hypotheses that can be accepted as facts or as universal or at least probabilistic laws. As I said, the methodology that is associated with each of these paradigms really flows from the ontological and epistemological assumptions, and it's not the focus of this talk to go into the different methods that qualitative and quantitative researchers use, although I will say something more about that later, but just to suggest some of the important differences, which many of you are probably already aware of, that qualitative researchers tend to rely heavily on interviews, ethnography, focus groups, participant observation, and documents such as letters or diaries, which can be content analyzed. Quantitative research, on the other hand, use surveys, usually either researcher-administered or self-administered, and often review records or documents for numeric information. Qualitative researchers, their data collection methods and design are less structured. You'll often hear the expression a semi-structured interview. Whereas with quantitative research, the data collection methods and designs are very structured. There's usually standardized measures or scales which have forced choice answers that the respondent must select from among. Qualitative researchers follow a design that is typically considered emergent or flexible, meaning that as things arise in the course of the study that they learn, they may decide to modify the design in certain ways by including different people in the sample, by adding or deleting certain questions from their interview guides. Whereas quantitative researchers, the research design is pre-planned and it's well set out in advance of the study and doesn't change in the course of it. Qualitative researchers use non-probability sampling. There are many kinds of non-probability sampling, but the point is they are not trying to generalize to a larger population, so they don't use probability statistics. They have probability sampling. They have other goals. While quantitative researchers usually do want to generalize back to a population, so they use probability sampling. With qualitative researchers, there is a reliance on inductive reasoning, while with quantitative researchers, there's a reliance on deductive reasoning. Qualitative researchers will typically present their findings in text, while quantitative researchers typically present their findings in statistics. So what are the commitments of qualitative researchers? When you decide to undertake qualitative research, what are you committing yourself to do? Well, first is to see the social world from the actor's point of view. The focus is on the participants' perceptions of their experiences. Qualitative researchers want to get an insider's view by entering into the participants' world. You might say the slogan of qualitative researchers is, "We want to get in your head." Qualitative researchers will try to accomplish this in a number of ways. First, by eliciting very thick descriptions of the experiences they might be trying to inquire about, or the decision-making they may be trying to understand. By getting very detailed descriptions that ask people to talk about how they felt, what they were thinking at the time. That's one way that they start to enter into the world of the participant and understand what was going on with him as this experience was happening or this decision was being made. Also by being empathic, by trying to put yourself in the place of the participant and understand what he was feeling at that time. Being attentive to the emotions that his narrative or account are evoking in you is another way of trying to understand the experience from the participant's point of view. And of course, qualitative research methods often emphasize sustained contact between the investigator and those that he is studying in order to gain deeper insights and be immersed in their world. Anthropologists who use ethnography, they immerse themselves in the culture for a period of time, living there, observing, participating in the way of life. But even people who aren't anthropologists who use qualitative methods often become immersed in an experience by trying to do participant observation or essentially by being very immersed in the data later. You will often hear that with qualitative research, there's less time and energy spent up front because the design will be emerging, so it isn't all well laid out, and much more time spent at the back end with the data analysis. Whereas quantitative researchers often spend more time up front laying out everything which is pre-planned and won't be changed, and then can accomplish the data analysis much more efficiently. Qualitative researchers are also interested in understanding the meaning that people assign to their behavior. And Max Weber, a very famous classical sociologist, argued that to truly understand social behavior, we must study the subjective meanings that motivate that behavior. Human behavior, unlike physical objects, cannot be understood without reference to the meanings and purposes that people attach to their experience and their activity. In fact, the ability to assign meaning to our actions and the inclination to want to do so is really part of what makes us distinctively human. Okay. We are not just molecules bouncing around. There is motive, intent, and goals behind the actions we undertake. And it's very important to understand what are the meanings people assign to their behavior. And when we try to understand the meaning, we're interested in questions like, why did this happen to me? Why do I want to do this? How does this affect my chances to meet my goals and needs? How does this affect how I feel about myself, or how other people may view me? All these are the meanings that people assign to their behavior. In fact, this realization of the importance of meaning is in large part what led to the development of qualitative methods. While the social sciences, when the social sciences began and well into the 20th century, social scientists used quantitative methods exclusively. And although these methods were initially developed to study the natural sciences like physics and chemistry, it was assumed that they would be appropriate to the social sciences too, because in both cases, researchers are looking to identify universal or probabilistic laws that can be used to predict, in the case of social sciences, predict social behavior. But eventually, some social scientists became dissatisfied with these methods for studying social phenomena. They felt that there were important differences between social life and physical phenomena, and that human behavior could not be understood without reference to the meanings and purposes human actors attach to their behavior. They argued that the proper focus of the social scientists was on the meaning people assigned to their experiences, and they started to develop new methods, which eventually became known as qualitative methods to accomplish this understanding of meaning. Meaning not only underlies our behavior, but of course our thoughts and our responses often to experiences. In a study of Vietnam veterans, Herb Hendon found that men who came back from the Vietnam War were more likely to experience PTSD than it appeared for men from other wars. And in trying to understand this, he really looked at the meaning men attached to their experience. And a lot of the meaning they attached to it was associated with the fact that it was a very unpopular war, that it was covered heavily in the media. The first war covered heavily in the media, particularly television. And also that when they came home, they were not treated as heroes. There was a lot of conflict and division about the war in the country, and many of them felt that their service was not appreciated. So all those things, he said, added to the meaning that people drew out of their service. They weren't able to draw the same positive meaning that other people have been able to draw when they were sort of welcomed back as heroes. And as a result, he said that meaning was very important to how they processed the experience of the war, and he felt ultimately contributed to a higher prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder. Qualitative researchers also put a lot of emphasis on the importance of context. By context, I mean time, place, and circumstances, and how that shapes people's interpretations of events, their responses to them, and the meaning and significance they assign to them. And obviously, context can very much influence our behavior, but also the meanings that we attach to it. So someone who grows up in a neighborhood where there's a great deal of violence, who makes a decision to join a gang, may assign very different meaning to that decision seeing it mostly as a survival tactic or a way to remain safe, than someone who grows up in a very middle-class environment with safe neighborhoods, but sees their joining a gang as kind of a rebellious activity or a rejection maybe of some of the values of the larger society. And whereas quantitative researchers try to discover context-free laws, qualitative researchers would say that's not possible, that action is very much determined by the context in which it occurs, and the meanings that are ascribed to that action are also very much shaped by the contextual circumstances. And in addition, qualitative researchers are committed to an inductive approach in which one builds up from the data to generate, for example, new constructs or hypotheses that are grounded in the data. Okay. So whereas a quantitative researcher will start with a theory or hypothesis and then work down gathering the data and seeing if that theory or hypothesis is substantiated by the data, qualitative researchers work up from the data. They work inductively. And an example of inductive reasoning would be Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes didn't come in with a theory about what had happened. He went in, looked at all the clues, which in a sense are the pieces of data, and from that he built up a theory about what could have happened that was consistent with the data. So it's very important to recognize that qualitative researchers really want what they learn, what they find, to be grounded in the data, to emerge from the data. And so they use an inductive approach. And because of this inductive approach, qualitative researchers have a somewhat ambivalent relationship to theory. It's not that they reject theory, but they worry that theory can be very constraining in terms of restricting what you look at and not allowing you to move from the data because your attention becomes very selectively focused on pieces of data that are consistent with the theory or the variables that are consistent with the theory. So they feel it's more conducive to an inductive approach, not to start with a theory or a hypothesis or a set of ideas that makes you look at the data in a different way. Qualitative researchers are also committed to seeking a holistic and integrated understanding of the phenomenon under investigation. So whereas quantitative researchers think you can break phenomena up into their constituent parts and study them individually, qualitative researchers think that that's not meaningful to do, and that we want to try to take a very holistic and integrated understanding of phenomenon. So qualitative researchers would say that you couldn't see in a survey, for instance, that people may hold very contradictory views because all this data will be aggregated, whereas when you take a holistic view and you ask him to talk about his whole perspective on a phenomenon, you can see that there may be some conflicting or inconsistent views, and that's not unusual. Human beings can hold inconsistent views in their minds, but it's very important, they feel, to really try to get this holistic, integrated understanding of phenomena, and not try to break phenomena up into their constituent parts and study them separately. Qualitative researchers, as I mentioned, are also committed to design flexibility and an emerging design. They will modify their research plans as the study unfolds in response to emerging or serendipitous findings. So questions may be added, topics may be added, new kinds of individuals may be added to the sample, all in response to what they are seeing emerge. Quantitative researchers, in contrast, tend to set out the research design in advance. It's all pre-planned in a very linear way, and they move through a sequence of steps. But with qualitative researchers, this isn't true. Their research process is much more organic, with possible backlooping or feedback throughout. Next, qualitative researchers are committed to a collaborative model of research, meaning that the research participant has much more of a say in how the research is conducted, in the sense that they can introduce new topics for discussion. They may be asked, what do you think is important for people to understand about other people who go through this phenomenon or this experience? So they might be asked to suggest questions even after the research is conducted. Some qualitative researchers will take the findings or their interpretations back to participants and ask them if they seem to resonate with their experience, if they think it is an accurate representation of their experience. So it's a much more of a collaborative endeavor, and there's much more of an egalitarian relationship between them, whereas in a quantitative study, everything, as I said, is pre-planned. New measures are not added because the participants might think they're important variables to include. Their opinions are never solicited on these things. And essentially, the researcher controls the whole research process. What questions will be asked, what measures will be included, what order the questions will be asked in, and how the analysis will proceed. Obviously this has implications for power in the relationship, and because it is a more egalitarian relationship with qualitative study, there is the belief that people will often be more willing to speak honestly, be comfortable, and feel willing to assert their opinions more forcefully. Next, qualitative researchers are committed to discovery, to generating new insights, constructs, and theories. The grounded theory approach, which is one approach to doing qualitative research, in particular, is set up to develop new theories. So, whereas quantitative research is trying to explain things so that they can get to universal or probabilistic laws that are context-free, qualitative research are trying to discover. They're trying to generate new insights, and they can do that because they're not constrained by a theory that tells them these are the important variables to look at. They have methods that allow things to come up that were not anticipated as important, by allowing people to speak expansively, by asking probing questions. So discovery is really at the heart of doing a qualitative research, and that's why sometimes people call it exploratory research, but it need not be exploratory. And finally, qualitative researchers recognize that subjectivity is always present to some degree, and engaging in reflexivity, in other words, thinking about how the values, the experiences, the perceptions you bring to the study, how they may influence your research. They may influence the questions you ask, they may influence who you choose to study, and they may influence your interpretations. Quantitative researchers believe that by following the scientific methods and certain procedures, that they can essentially eliminate bias from research. Qualitative researchers would say that's impossible. Values always enter into the research process. People are always influenced in what they see by how they frame a problem, how they choose to study it, and that the way that they try to minimize the problems of subjectivity is by engaging, as I indicated, in this reflexivity, not something that quantitative researchers do. And of course, we know that there is bias that exists in quantitative research, recall bias, social desirability bias, acquiescence bias. All these things exist, and strategies have been developed by quantitative research for trying to deal with them. But often they're merely acknowledged at the end of a report of a study and not really addressed. So now, when is the choice of a qualitative approach the right one? Well, as I mentioned, qualitative researchers are very interested in discovery. So when a problem or a phenomenon being studied is still very ill-defined or not well understood, that is usually an opportunity for a qualitative study. For example, how do people who meet strangers who are genetically linked to them come to think about their relationship or ties to these individuals? So, for instance, through 23andMe, people are able to come into contact with others who essentially, up till this point, have been strangers to them, but they are genetically linked. And how do they come to think about their relationship or ties to these individuals? What kind of relationships do they form with them? This is a new phenomenon, so there's really very little understood about it right now, so you wouldn't be able really to rush to a study where you felt you knew all the variables in advance that were important to look at to say, for instance, why some people developed ongoing relationships with these people they met and others didn't after an initial encounter or two. Or there are new genetic advances that are going on that give people unprecedented opportunities to get information about what their future health status is likely to be. How does having this information influence their current sense of well-being is one important question. And very little is understood about this right now because these are essentially, again, new opportunities people have to get this information. So here would be another instance where a qualitative study would be an appropriate one. Also, when you want to develop hypotheses or a theory or a model about some phenomenon that is currently not well understood. So, for instance, Kubler-Ross's model of the stages of grief derived from her many interviews with dying patients. These were qualitative data she had, really, for the most part, unstructured interviews with patients she spoke to over a long period of time, but she was able to treat these as data and, based on that, develop a model of stages of grief that people went through. So if you're interested in developing a model about something that's not well understood, this qualitative approach would probably be a very suitable one. To identify unanticipated consequences is another reason you might want to use a qualitative approach. Intervention researchers typically evaluate certain endpoints or primary outcomes and whether these were achieved and how the frequency with which these endpoints were achieved might differ between experimental and with one or more experimental groups and a control group. However, interventions have unanticipated consequences, and typically these are not looked at. They could be positive, they could be negative. And it's also important to identify them because they are part of the costs and benefits of doing the intervention. And these unanticipated consequences are best captured with methods that allow people to talk about what the experience of being in the intervention was like, what they got out of it, and what were some of the maybe costs or burdens that they experienced by having to participate. When investigating very complex issues, which it's hard to tease apart, they're very complex, things are very interrelated, then it may be another good opportunity to use a qualitative approach. When the phenomenon being investigated is just innately complex and difficult to capture with forced choice, standardized measures, such as having someone try to explain to you about what's the nature of their spirituality, or a couple trying to decide who's using assisted reproductive techniques whether to have multifetal reduction when there are several fetuses, and that's not necessarily safe for the mother or for the children, are more likely to result in premature birth. So people will have to make a decision maybe whether to have multifetal reduction. And that's a very complex issue because it's very tied up to people's ideas of parenting and protecting your children even while they're still a fetus. How will they be looked upon by other people if they do this? Often people that have using these technologies have waited a very long time to conceive a child, and there's a lot of complex feelings about now possibly terminating some of these embryos. And a decision like, ending life support for a relative, that's a very complex decision which you have to consider. What is the medical prognosis? What does the person want in terms of ending their life or continuing it? What are the costs to the family emotionally of having to make this choice? They're just inherently very complex issues that you really can't capture with forced choice questions. And of course, when investigating sensitive topics, some topics are just so difficult and painful for people to talk about that they require building a trust and rapport beforehand, and allowing people to tell their story in their own words. These topics, such as the loss of a child, being turned down, let's say, for a liver transplant, having experienced childhood sexual abuse, these topics are very delicate, and you need to have responsive questions that are posed in response to what the person has said and that are very adapted to the personal circumstances of the person. I think most people would agree it would be insensitive to ask people about the loss of a child with forced choice questionnaire. It doesn't allow them to talk about the experience in their own terms and the meanings it had for them. Finally, when you're trying to understand or trace a process, a qualitative approach is a good one. Researchers are often interested in how people arrive at a decision, let's say a decision to accept hospice care and end all curative treatment, a decision to request physician-assisted suicide, a decision to divorce a spouse, or maybe interested in the process of how people take on a new identity, such as after an accident, how does one take on the identity of being a disabled person? How does someone who's ended treatment take on the identity of being a cancer survivor? How does someone who is discharged from the Army take on the identity of being a civilian again? What is the pathway to some outcome? What do people do on the pathway to entering psychotherapy? What are the things that they try to do first to alleviate their distress, and how ultimately do they get into psychotherapy? These are all processes which it's very hard to study because it requires often a very careful ordering of events and an understanding how one transitions through stages to arrive at a final decision or a new identity. And this is best studied through a qualitative approach. I just want to say something about the strengths and limitations of different methodologies and how they are evaluated. When trying to evaluate the strengths and limitations of any methodology, you must apply the appropriate criteria, not ones that reflect a paradigm with a different epistemology and ontology. And often you will hear people be critical of qualitative research on a number of counts about the lack of generalizability, about the lack of replicability of the findings. But these are applying criteria which are not relevant to the paradigm that qualitative research subscribes to. So just as an analogy, if you took downhill versus cross-country skiing, each of these kinds of skiing has different benefits and risks. Each provides different kinds of enjoyment. One needs to master different techniques to do well at each. There are different kinds of equipment used, different costs involved in doing each kind, and each is done on a different kind of terrain. So, would you judge the equipment that was designed for cross-country skiing by how well it lets you to do downhill skiing? No, of course you wouldn't. And similarly, qualitative methods have different underlying assumptions, different goals than quantitative research, and therefore their value should not be judged by the same criteria. Finally, when you try to make one methodological approach, usually it's the qualitative one that people are trying to make conform to another, the epistemology and ontology of another approach, usually quantitative. You simply eviscerate what is unique and valuable in the former model, the former approach. So if you try to get qualitative research to adhere to the epistemology and ontology and methods of quantitative research, you're going to really just strip the qualitative method of what is unique and valuable about it. And inevitably, you'll find the first approach deficient because you're asking it to do something it isn't designed to do or suited to do. So in conclusion, I just want to emphasize that no research approach is inherently superior for studying all kinds of problems and research questions. Methodological orthodoxy, what is often called methodolatry, should be replaced by methodological appropriateness, in which the approach should be dictated by the research question and the goals of the research. And knowledge is rarely, if ever, fully objective and is always shaped by the purposes, the perspectives, and the methods of those who produce it, and often, we might say, by those who fund it. The methods we use to gather data will always influence what we find. If I go into the sea with a net with 2-inch holes, what I'll discover is that there are no fish smaller than 2 inches in the sea. And finally, all knowledge produced by research is selective and partial, because all data are a representation of only some parts of reality. So just as the parable of the blind men who were each touched a different part of an elephant, and based on the part they touched, decided it was like a wall, or it was like a snake, or it was like a rope, they all only had a part of the reality of the elephant. And similarly, qualitative and quantitative methods each selectively look at part of a reality. And as a result, all research, regardless of the paradigm, is selective and is partial. Thank you very much.